It's okay. I'm going to get started. I just wanted I will be here very briefly. My name is Matthew Gabriel. I'm the chair of the Department of Religion and Culture here at Virginia Tech. It's the department's great pleasure to host this event, exploring Black religion and sexuality. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Professor Amaryah Armstrong, and who will lead the discussion. And I will note, however, that because of the webinar style format, I think that the speakers would love to hear your questions. And if you want to ask questions of them, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and post them there. And if there's time, I'm sure they'll get to as many as they can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amaryah and enjoy the program.
Hi, thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm Professor Amaryah Armstrong, work in the Department of Religion and Culture, and so excited about this conversation, getting to think with some of my favorite people. I just want to give a little bit of introduction, both to the panel and to the speakers, and then we'll go ahead and jump in. But part of why I wanted to have this conversation was a lot of discussions of Black religion and sexuality can so often focus on things like religious repression of sexuality or notions of having to reconcile sexuality and religion, especially Black sexuality and religion. And I was wondering, what would happen if that was not the starting place for the conversation? Or what if we assumed that people, the ways that they're thinking about Black religion and sexuality are not simply determined by a kind of conservative Christian notion of what religion and sexuality are and are about. So I'm hoping this conversation can get at some of the complexities of Black religion and sexuality without simply repeating those kinds of norms about how the two relate. I'm really excited to have our speakers and panelists with us today, some of my favorite people to think with and hear from. So I'm just going to give a little go-around introduction, starting with Minister Candace Simpson, who is a sister preacher and educator, a graduate of Trinity College and Union Theological Seminary. She also works as an associate minister at Concord Baptist Church of Christ in Brooklyn. Candace is a wonderful political educator, which she brings together with Christian education to do very innovative work. She also works as a curriculum designer and lead writer at Fish Sandwich Heaven, an online resource for dreaming a freer world. Be sure to check out that website. It's got some great resources. Next, we have Zaynab Shahar, who is a writer based in Chicago, Illinois. Zaynab is pursuing their doctorate at Chicago Theological Seminary. Their work is really compelling, bringing together lots of innovative things, thinking about Jewish and Islamic law, spiritual abolition and theological imagination, as well as abolition and disability. I'm so excited that Zaynab could be here with us today. And then finally, we have Dr. Biko Mandel Gray, who is an assistant professor of religion at Syracuse University. He reads and writes and thinks about Black life, religion, and ethics. And his first monograph, Black Life Matter, which we're all eagerly anticipating, is scheduled to be published next year by Duke University Press. So congratulations on that, my brother. But yeah, these are our panelists. And I sent them a couple of questions, some guiding questions just to lead off the discussion, which I'll share with you all. And then maybe we can have you all go around and share some of your thoughts on those questions I sent. But my first questions were, how do you situate yourself in relationship to Black religiosity? And how does that shape your understanding of Black sexuality? And then I also asked, how does your understanding of Black sexuality shape how you live in and make meaning of the world? So maybe we can start with Candace and play popcorn from there.
Sure. First off, it's so good to see you and be with you and spend time with you. Thank you for having us. And I'm just so glad that you framed this conversation in this way, because I cannot tell you how many times someone has invited me to do the "how can you be queer and Christian" conversation. And the answer has lately been, please don't call me for this. The answer to that question is, I just am, and it just is. And so I'm grateful that we're not responding to that as our starting place, because with everything going around us, everything going on around us, we just don't have the time to make people's lives a debate. I just don't have time for it. The question was about how do we situate ourselves to Black religiosity? And we were joking a little bit earlier before we went live, because in our emails, I had mentioned, I wish we were together because I have church candies that I would love to share with y'all. And I think that's where I want to start. Like, I want to start from that place, that very fleshly place, that very embodied place that I find that the divine meets me. And so I am a Baptist Christian. I have been at the same church since before I was born. So both of my parents are pastors at the Concord Baptist Church of Christ in Brooklyn. And when I think about my place in Black religiosity, I think about being together. Not necessarily doctrine, not necessarily creeds. Well, we don't believe in creeds as Baptists anyway. A lot of things we don't believe in, and we just do a lot of things our own way. That's what it means to be Baptist. But I miss the being together, because even on certain topics that I just don't know that I'm still personally struggling with, I know that being together is something significant. And so I'm grieving that in this season. I'm grieving this Sunday would have been our annual Usher sermon. And what I love about the Usher sermon is that it is an opportunity for people, all the ushers from like our sister churches in the area come together, and the ushers just strut. And I actually don't know anything about the history of it, but what I do know is that I have always been fascinated by the ways that regular Black people get a chance to strut and get a chance to be models on the catwalk, if you could see it in that way. And so there's something very fleshy and embodied that I miss. And so I think I'm situating myself, yes, as a Christian, yes, as a queer person, and as someone who has flesh. And the text that really resonates for me in that regard is Isaiah 40, verse 5, where the writer says something to the effect of, "And all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it," which is one of my favorite bits of poetry, because it suggests that there's something divine about our flesh, that we get to see something that is glorious through our flesh. And that doesn't necessarily mean sexual. I mean, it means good food. It means laughter. It means clean air. It means clean water, the things that our flesh deserve and need. And I love the way the writer kind of imagines the Lord as having a mouth, that God also has flesh that has a need. And perhaps we might be the flesh of God also. So I'm really excited about this conversation, looking forward to what other people are thinking through.
Thanks, Candace. Biko or Zaynab, feel free to jump in. Okay, maybe Zaynab, you can go and then go to Biko.
Oh, playing eye chicken totally did not work out in my favor right there. Okay, so thank you again, Amaryah, for inviting me. Like Candace, when I'm typically invited to do conversations like this, they're typically along very trite lines of like, what does Islam have to say about X? And I'm like, I could say a lot of words that don't make a whole lot of sense to you because you don't have a context for this tradition. So trying to talk about my faith as if it's like a puppet on my hand and I'm an extra in Sesame Street is not really helpful, right? But how do I situate myself? Above and beyond being an academic of comparative jurisprudence, I'm most importantly a Muslim and a dervish by initiation. I'm a Shisti dervish under the tutelage of the late Ibrahim Farajajeh, who was like a very, very openly Black, bisexual, queer man who taught at Howard University and Starr King School for the Ministry up until his death. And one of the things that I think about in situating myself in that way is that, like, for me, what I guess some people would call mysticism, but for me, it's just like being a Sufi is thinking about like the liminal meeting spaces, the places where we go to meet each other. And I think that has informed a lot of how I understand Black religiosity. Because to be honest, when I typically think about this question, it's like, what do you think about Black religiosity? And it's usually, what do you think about Black Christianity? And I'm like, I don't really have anything to say in that regard because that's just not my experience. But I'm interested in like the places where people who are typically outside of that conversation meet and have met each other. Like, I'm interested in the fact that I've met queer Black Buddhists in a Sangha, for example, and we can talk about how both of the prophets of our religion felt it necessary to walk away from society and receive revelation under a tree. Like, if that is not like the queerest thing on earth, to remove yourself from the world and go receive the word of the Lord or your prophet under a plant, I don't know what is, right? I like to think about the places where we, as Candace said, get to be enfleshed, right? Where we get to talk about like what are our real physical experiences and how we are processing them, right? So what does it actually mean to, say, walk a path trying to obtain either enlightenment or some kind of divine higher knowing, and how that can be difficult at times, but also just really interesting because you are going places that you didn't anticipate, but you were brought there for a reason. So if anything, I situate myself within the context of what it means to constantly seek out knowledge, but also embody a desire to understand the divine on a deeper level.
Thank you all for this. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. Yeah, thank you. I also have to say thanks. Maury and I started getting to know each other a while back, and we have perpetual beefs about Star Trek and Star Wars, and it's important to name that we can care for one another across very serious divides. Star Wars is crucial for me, and that's a whole other conversation. But I had to bring it up. It's so fascinating listening to Candace and Zaynab because I have not been asked this question before. I've not been asked to have conversations about the relationship between Blackness, Black religiosity, and sexuality. Oftentimes I'm asked the political question of how does Black Lives Matter relate to religion? How does state-sanctioned violence relate to religion and religiosity? And so in a certain way, asking this question from this angle is really refreshing for me. And I come at it, how do I situate myself in relation to Black religiosity? I tell people most of the time personally that I am too Christian for atheists and not Christian enough for Christians. What that ultimately means is at the end of the day, the salvific figure that we call Christ for me was a queer man who literally embodied a particular kind of love ethic. And so questions of resurrection are not questions that are of material import to me in terms of my own personal confessional faith. It doesn't mean that I don't have a stance one way or the other is the easiest way to articulate that in terms of my personal sort of faith walk. What I can say, however, in terms of as an academic, which is for me the more interesting side of things, is that for me, Blackness and religiosity aren't always good bedfellows. What I mean by that is that not to like think with Christianity axiomatically, but actually to think about what Blackness means to the West, what Black people mean to the West, how Black flesh is understood in the West. It's not always a pleasant relationship, even with religious orientations. And so, what we do to religion, or what Blackness does to religion and religiosity to me, is on the one hand, it calls it into question. And so I call the notion of religion into question, not particular orientations or faith claims, but actually the idea of religion as a bounded thing. I call that into question. But it's so great to be on a panel with Candace and Zaynab as they're talking about flesh, because I also think that the way that I situate myself to Black religiosity is that Blackness articulates a fleshiness, a fleshliness that is in many ways creating very real possibilities for sociality and community. And so, in this regard, Blackness sort of disrupts a certain kind of understanding of the social that normative understandings of religion typically sort of invoke. I mean, we were talking about candies at the bottom of purses at the beginning, and I was also thinking about shouting in Black because I'm a Kojic boy. I come up as a Kojic boy, and so I think about shouting and about my inability to shout. I don't have enough rhythm to do it, but thinking about how people would get together and how that flesh would move and how certain people would be sweating and people would be holding one another and touching one another and engaging in this sort of deep in flesh communion and communality. And I think about that in relation to how we are treated outside of these spaces of fleshly sociality. What does it mean for us to find refuge in the touch of another, in the embrace of another, in the motherboard coming with the sheets after you've been passed out because of the spirit? What does it mean for those? What does it mean for us to create those new possibilities? And I think there's something profound in that fleshly holding, in that holding that flesh offers, like communal, collective, social flesh. And so I think on the one hand, just to wrap up, I situate myself toward Black religiosity on the one hand, thinking about how these things rub up against one another in difficult ways, but then also thinking at the same time about how Black flesh rubs up against itself in ways that open up new possibilities, or that at least can open up new possibilities.
Yeah, thank you all so much for getting us started in such a generative way. Also, yeah, just want to announce again, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom. I have, one of the things I was thinking about as you all were talking about this kind of like fleshiness and the sense of like sexuality and the erotic. Zaynab, you mentioned like, you know, having a meeting with somebody where you all were able to talk about the way the prophets in both of your traditions kind of go away from society and receive revelation under a tree. And a question that I've been thinking with a lot is like how certain religious concepts relate to my understanding of sexuality. So something like revelation, for instance, is like a regular one for me where I'm just like, oh, when I came out, it felt like the world was just like, and not even just coming out, but coming to like a certain sense of my Blackness as well. Like there's a way both of those things have felt like a certain kind of revelation to me. And I was curious, are there like religious concepts that kind of have journeyed with you in thinking about your sexuality and the way you move through the world in a similar way? Or what would some of those be?
If you don't mind, I'm a hop in here. So I remember when I was in grad school and we had this book, and Amaryah, I know y'all probably know this text. It's by Charles Long. It's Significations. Can you all hear me fine? Y'all can hear me? Good. Okay. Y'all can hear me okay? We're good. Okay, yeah, just want to make sure. It's this text by Charles Long called Significations. And long and the short, the first time I read it, I had no clue what was going on in this text. Let's just be frank. I read it in grad school and I was like, this is confusing. But eventually this text opened up this idea of religion as orientation for me. And this was the one word that conceptually stuck with me as it relates to me thinking about the relationship between religion and sexuality, particularly Black religion and sexuality. And what does it mean to what does it mean for religion to be an orienting device and sexuality to also be a modality of orientation or disorientation? How do we think about these two things in relation to one another? And so the concept that just keeps coming to me is actually orientation. There's a scholar named Sarah Ahmed who writes a book called Queer Phenomenology that talks about queerness as the slanting of orientation, as the disorienting or the reorienting work that happens with queerness. And I think about Blackness as that kind of like disorienting, reorienting force that as it relates to religion opens up new worlds of meaning. How do we orient ourselves toward the world as it relates to sort of anything, just ultimate concern, as Tillich might say. So yeah, I think about orientation as the term that comes to mind for me.
Something that's pretty significant for me is the practice of testifying. And testifying is, when I was younger, I used to be so afraid when we would have watch night service and people would get up and like tell their stories, because I had always felt this fire to get up and say something myself. Like I always felt like, oh, should I go up and like talk about how God has brought me through 8th grade? You know, like in my mind, I watched other people testify and tell their story. And I watched how the congregation would respond to that testimony. And, you know, when I was a child, I had really, really bad like stage fright. Like I didn't want to be in front of adults. And I certainly didn't want to be speaking in front of adults about God, which I thought was so intimate. Like, why are y'all having this very intimate conversation? In my mind as a child, I was like, why are y'all having this very personal conversation with like hundreds of people at a time on New Year's Eve? Like, this is really, really, it's a lot. But as I got older, I really have come to value the power of testifying, even about things that have nothing, or at least on the appearance, nothing to do with God. One of my favorite songs is I Shall Wear a Crown. And the lyrics are basically, I shall wear a crown when it's all over. I'm gonna put on my robe and tell the story of how I made it over soon as I get home. And it doesn't matter who's singing it. It really does not matter who's singing it. As long as it is a like full choir, I will always cry and I will always weep, because I think about particularly Black people. And for me, as a Black queer person, what it would feel like at some point to testify about all the stuff that we've made it through, all the stuff that they tried to do to us. You know, the Lucille Clifton poem, come and celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill us and has failed, right? Like there's something beautiful about testifying about the things that you've made it through, not because God loves you more or you are favored or you are special or chosen, but that there's something healing in the testimony that we have that other people can get set free with. So earlier this week was coming out day, and the older I get, the less I enjoy it, because for so many of us, like, what even is coming out, and what are we amplifying? What are we putting on a pedestal? What are we praising? And I got until like 8 p.m. on Sunday before I posted anything about it. And I was like, you know what? I want to document this. Like, I want to testify about just being here, because perhaps someone else is wondering what it's like to be on that side. And so part of me feels like there is something very queer and very faithful about telling your story. And I imagine that one day, you know, if heaven is real and I get to go, I'm telling God on everybody. Like, I have a list of people that I'm just going to tattle to God about. And I've already been doing that, because we get to say, what our experience is. And so when people say, oh, well, it wasn't that bad, or like, you know, you'll be all right, you just got to forgive. No, I don't have that experience. And I get to testify in a tongue that is familiar to me.
Oh my Lord. The thought of Candace like just standing there with this huge scroll that's like, so let me tell God about everybody who ever did me dirty in life. I'm imagining the times that I text Candace and I'm like, so who is this random like person who's making the rounds from, you know, Black Christian social media to my timeline are probably on that list somewhere. So one thing that I think stands out for me is the notion of self-annihilation and my tradition. It's simply called like dying before you die. And a really simplistic way of explaining it is that as a dervish, you are supposed to think about the fact that, you know, you're not going to live forever functionally. And as a facet of not being, you know, eternal or immortal, you have to think about what kind of life you want to live. And the way that I connect this to like Blackness and sexuality is because I feel like, especially in the process of going through grad school, there have been times where, as much as I have tried to resist, like going through that process of going deeper into myself and confronting things that I did not want to confront, somehow self-annihilation creeps up and makes me reckon with not only the hold that I have placed over myself, but the hold that I think other things have had on me, regardless of whether I'm aware of that or not. And it has been a very intense couple of years of allowing that process to really create new possibilities in my life that I didn't think would ever be a thing. And when I often think about self-annihilation within a Sufi context, I think so much about Black queerness because I feel like we're always evolving. And people call it in the terms of like reinvention. And I'm like, sure, like reinvention is an aspect of it. But I also think there's an aspect of just going deeper into yourself and really thinking about like, am I living a life that's a reflection of the life I want to live, or am I reflecting things that I feel like will gain me access to, say, like social capital or financial wealth or status in the community or this, that, and the third? Like, what has a hold over my life that is preventing me from seeing my own life with the kind of eyes and clarity that I might actually need versus what I assume is necessary? So self-annihilation has kind of been a thing that I've been practicing with more intensely over the years.
Yeah, thank you. Zaynab, that's, well, both you and Candace, I feel like, brought in these kinds of themes of finitude. And it's interesting because I was, you know, preparing my questions for this. I had a question about like death and religion and sexuality. In my religion and literature class, we've been reading Toni Morrison's Sula recently. And there's a scene where Sula's having sex and you're kind of privy to like what's going on in her head. And a lot of it is her like reflecting on death and reflecting on finitude and kind of like fleetingness of life and decay, but not just for herself, but at this kind of cosmic level and at this kind of communal level. And I was wondering if we could maybe extend some of these ideas y'all are talking about and think some more about like what are the ways that like sex and sexuality play a role in this kind of like marking of time and experience of finitude, especially when we think about the oppressive conditions of anti-Blackness that Black people live under and the like intensification of that when you're Black and queer or trans. Like, how do you all kind of think together with sex and religion about death and finitude?
Can I ask a relatively naive question, Amaryah, to you, to just throw one back at you? How do you read Nell and Sula's relationship at the beginning of the novel, talking about sex and sexuality, and then of course, I'm forgetting old boy's name. I ain't gonna give the story away, but old boy who ends up in the lake, and
Yes.
yeah, we're gonna leave it. We'll leave it. But how do you read Nell and Sula's relationship to one another early on? Because I don't know. I can't. I mean, Morrison is such a tricky writer. She's incredible, but there's something there about their relationship in my mind that is erotic, but not in a weird like kitty like. But there is an eros shared between Nell and Sula that I'm interested, I guess, in asking everyone to think about, because you're talking about marking time. They were kids when they were laying in the grass with each other. So it's just a question, a naive question, probably, but I'm interested.
Yeah. Well, thank you for turning my hosting this panel into an occasion to question me. It's interesting. One of my favorite pieces of like literary criticism is, I think Barbara Smith has a piece on Toni Morrison Sula that's like reading Toni Morrison Sula as a lesbian novel. And I think that piece came under a lot of fire when it was written, because I think people were kind of assuming she was reading it in a kind of literal way. But part of what she was talking about was the way that Sula, especially, I think, lives in that novel, the way she kind of takes up this position as a pariah, uh, and also her relationship with Nell and the kind of erotic sensibility and questioning and exploratory openness they feel together, like that. For Smith, I think was a sign of like what lesbian kind of represents as a like mode of being. And I think that's how I interpret it. I always say Sula is the reason that I came out reading that book. And so, um, yeah. But yeah, I think there's definitely some relationship between the erotic that Morrison is exploring there and, um, uh, yeah, finitude.
Maybe I shouldn't. I mean, I didn't mean to put it back on you. You just mentioned Sula, and I thought it was a fantastic. Sula is quickly becoming one of my like favorite Toni Morrison novels, and so I think Sula made. So there's two texts that made me more comfortable with my queerness, and Sula was one of them. So it was Sula and actually Wayward Lies Beautiful Experiments. Both of them, Saidiya Hartman's text, Wayward Lies Beautiful Experiments, both of them mark queerness in ways that both announce its erotic possibilities, but also announce the violence that will be visited upon people who are queer in the world. And there's just, I don't know, I don't know. I'm thinking about the freedom that comes, particularly with a character like Sula, how she's moving through the world and being relatively free in terms of the way that she moves sexually, and the way that she just moves in relation to Nell too. So I don't know. I'm hearing you, and I'm like, there's something about the way that Sula is assertive sexually, that does some things. I'm gonna chill here, but
No,
yeah,
you're cool.
yeah.
I was wondering, I feel like we have a question from the audience and we'll love to have a little generative back and forth. But maybe we can take up this question, which I think is kind of resonant with what we're talking about. Amari Weeks asks, along these lines, I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts about how queer sex can be thought of as a potential practice of communion. So whoever wants to take that one up, feel free to hop up on it.
I am of many minds about this. I think if you had asked me this some years ago, the idea of queer sex would, as communion, would have really like been affirming to me. I mean, it's still affirming. I'm not gonna say it's not affirming. Like it's a great idea, but I think sometimes my fear, and I think we can say this now because we're already not speaking with a cishet gaze over this conversation, which I value. But I think there are things that we as queer folks do to like find the revolutionary thread in the mundane. And I don't know that it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. It's just a thing that we do. I mean, people will say that brunch is revolutionary. It is. I mean, hell, now it's really revolutionary because I would love nothing more than to be at a table of 6 of my favorite friends, and bottomless mimosas would really do something for my spirit. But that's not where we are right now. But I think, you know, when we say queer sex as communion, I get the hope of it. I get the thrust of it. I get that there's something significant. I mean, I can hear like even the words that we say at the communion table in our church, like, this is my body broken for you. Take, eat ye all of it. It's a very like fleshly way to speak about that ritual. And sometimes sex is just sex. Like, and sometimes, I think it was Crystal who said this on Twitter, like sometimes people just be gay and it just is what it is. I mean, gay as like this umbrella catch-all term, and I know that's problematic on some levels, but sometimes people just are what they are. Like earlier this week, you know, there was a video of Cardi B and she's like, oh, I'm gonna just say it the way that she says it because I know this is a safe place. She was like, it's been some years since I ate some pussy. I might do it again tonight. And the whole time I'm like, yeah, like Cardi has spoken about queer sex acts in her music and like direct, like, I mean, she has a way of she's not just messing with cishet men. She's not. And it was interesting to me how like a lot of folks, when the WAP video came out, missed a lot of the intimacy between Meg and Cardi because there's this idea that like, oh, they're doing it for the male gaze, whatever that means. And I think part of that is because we think that queer sex is some like precursor to a revolution that like, you know, once you do this thing, then, you know, you get your like socialist communist starter pack and you become like, once you actually meet this level of the revolution because you've had the queer sex, then you're initiated into this project. But sometimes people just be bumping uglies. Like, it just is what it is. Like, sometimes people just smash. So all that to say that, I mean, because if that's the case, you know, people like Lena Waithe, who have proven themselves over and over to be traitors to not just queer folks, but like women and survivors of sexual assault. So is she a revolutionary because she likes what she likes? I mean, I don't know that that's it, but I do think that there are moments where we see something that no one else can see in intimacy. And I think the conversation around queer sex as revolutionary or as like a practice of communion is a good one. And it also leaves out our comrades who are asexual and don't have interest in those sorts of encounters. So does that mean that they're not literally at the table? There's a lot of puns to be made about communion and queer sex, but I'm gonna just let that be, and we can put it all together in our minds.
I don't want to inhibit anyone else from answering if they wanted to, but there's another interesting question in the Q&A. Zaynab, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. So I'm glad that Candace framed her answer the way that she did, because one of the things that always made me kind of like itch in queer theological spaces is like this jump to be like, queer sex is holy and like queer relationships are holy and this, that, and the third, and like people butchering the crap out of like Marcia Althus Reed and just trying to turn Gail Rubin into a Bible that she kind of isn't, you know? Like, it just, like, don't get me wrong, I love I love deviations. I love books about, you know, lesbian sexuality and kink and all that jazz. But like, I guess what I would say to the person who wants to think of it as queer communion, I think it's really important to think about why exactly we need to be considered, like queer sex needs to be considered holy, right? Like, what is that effectively supposed to do for us? Is it supposed to make it feel as though, you know, our sexual acts are not dirty, are not perverted, are not like cast in this other light that they typically are? Does that, does the work of calling something like communion or sexual communion or whatever actively dismantle any of those things that cause us issues in terms of thinking positively, negatively, neutral, or otherwise about how we engage sex and sexuality? And I would also just say, like, personally, I just have no desire for like my like queer sexual acts to be considered holy all the fucking time. That's a really high barometer that, I'm sorry, like, I'm just not trying to jump up to every single time I need to let off some steam, okay? And also, as a like proudly polyamorous person, to have to be holy with like multiple different people on a Tuesday, like, I would have no energy. I'm sorry. Like, I think there are definitely times where like me and like a partner have intentionally created like sacred sexual space. And I think that's meaningful when you actually take the intention to do so. But for to just be this flat barometer of like all queer bumping is blessed is like, no, I'm sorry. Count me out. I want no parts. Like, you know, and I'm also admittedly like, I'm a pervert. I enjoy like downright dirty things. I really don't care if like people think the way I engage people sexually is disgusting or weird or whatever. And I'm just like, most of you needed the term pleasure activist to even start thinking about how you enjoy pleasure. So like, until you clear that hurdle in the 5K, like, I don't really care what people have to say to that degree. I know some people do, and I'm not trying to dismiss that as invalid. But when you peel back the layer of gazes that you think are looking at you and your sexual acts, you're gonna find that A, people ain't paying attention that hard, and B, they are probably looking at other possibilities because they have a difficult time conceptualizing anything besides, like, I hate to put it this way, the abject misery that people make like compulsory heterosexuality sound like. Okay. But at the end of the day, I just don't need everything to be sacred. It's just not necessary for me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this realness. I'm enjoying this so much. Uh, I want to also, since we've got about 10 minutes or so left in this conversation, we have another question from our attendees, Christopher Hunt, who asked, continuing on this theme of Black literature in connection to sexuality, what are some of your favorite pieces of Black literature that display the intersection of Blackness, spirituality, sexuality, and queerness?
I'll hop in here briefly. But I just want to affirm what Candace and Zaynab said before I answer this question. Yes to all of that. And there's something about raising queer sex to the level of a norm that actually disrupts the abnormality that like the generative abnormality or the like the resistant nature of queerness. It may not be revolutionary, but there's something odd to me. Sometimes you just fucking, I probably shouldn't have said it that way, but there's really something about just and I don't mean it casually, but just there's something to be said for we doing what we doing, we need not raise this to the level of an axiomatic norm around which like all of a sudden things are like transcendental. I just wanted to echo everything that was said earlier. In terms of text, there's a text, speaking of text, that actually do this. There's a book that a good friend of mine, Jessica Davenport, introduced me to in graduate school by an author named Anne Shockley, I think is how you pronounce it. And it's called Say Jesus and Come to Me. I read it for the first time in grad school and said, I wish this was my story. I wish this was my song, in large part because the protagonist in that narrative actually does not have any problems being an avowed person who is clearly Christian, and yet at the same time getting busy, right? And not raising it always to the level of like queer communion when she's getting busy with other women. And so that's one text that comes to mind. The other one that comes to mind for me personally, and it's something that really helped me work through my stuff as a Black queer man, was, I mean, a classic, James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. That was one that just undid me, just because I felt his repression, and felt his repression by his dad, and also felt the liberation that could potentially come from, in a certain way, a self-reckoning. So those are the two texts that came to mind for me.
Oh, I really appreciate a clarification that about the question about queer sex and communion. Just to say, I don't mean to suggest that sex has to be holy, but in thinking about the overlapping of Blackness, religion, and sexuality, was hoping to hear thoughts on what that could possibly mean to think sex and intimacy within a vocabulary of both sexuality and religion at the same time. I'm totally down with thinking about sex or dirty or perversion, etc. But then is that the primary way in which we should be thinking about the relationality between sex or sex acts and religion?
Ooh, let me answer. So I think if you're going to think about the synergy between Blackness and religiosity and sexuality, I think you need to just accept that there's no primary way of thinking about anything. Okay, like Black religion is always multi-religious, it's always syncretic in ways that people would just not particularly expect. And unlike Eurocentric Cartesian models of religion and sexuality in the body, where like European Christianity is at the center and everything has to orient it around in a particular way, I think Blackness, the relationship between Blackness and religion and sexuality, is far more pluriversal. Okay, so the grammar's a possibility that you are going to use for how you put those things together depends on where you're entering from and where you want to go and where that journey takes you. But fundamentally, like, there is no primary way of describing it, because aside from the fact that like there are a pluriverse of religious and racial and sexual orientations, there are pluriverse of possibilities happening. Like as Candace mentioned, there are asexual queer people of queer Black people, you know? There are people for whom sex is not primary, or that is not the sole form of communion that is even worth thinking about, you know? So if you think about it as, what is this the primary grammar? Primacy purposefully excludes a lot of things that are generative and meaningful and thought-provoking. So for me personally, like, yeah, I'm very open about saying like, ain't nothing I do in the dark is particularly that holy, okay? But I know plenty of similarly queer polyamorous people who are like, yeah, having multiple relationships is like a gift from God and this, that, and the third and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, hey, listen, if that's how you feel, if that's your grammar, then like go with it, you know? But I would caution away from the need to like place a primacy on any kind of grammar between the relationships of these things, because I think one of the things that Blackness and religion and sexuality are always actively trying to disrupt is that there is one narrative, one speech, one way of thinking or doing these things in the first place.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to think with that a little bit because I think there's an interesting thing too where it could seem like one is kind of like separating sex acts and religiosity or something in not saying that you're doing this Zaynab, but like it seems like given so much of our society is kind of like either like transcendentalizing sex to be this like very ideal thing, kind of abstracted or whatever from the messiness. There's also some ways that like religion can get just like kind of kicked out of sex as something to like think about it with. And yeah, I think what you're saying about this kind of plurality is really important to hold on to. So we've got one last question I think we can get to before we get out of here. Um, and yes, there will be a replay available. We'll be sharing that on the Religion and Culture website when this is done. But the final question is from one of our attendees. I'm interested in your thoughts about joy and religiosity that centers hetero/homonormativity. In your opinions, if joy comes in the morning, what comes at night?
I follow. I'm thinking through this on two levels. One, I'm thinking with what Zaynab just articulated in terms of grammars. So to punctuate joy as coming in the morning is in and of itself something that we have to call into question, right? That joy is a grammar that can be available as a praxis, like something that can be available beyond the morning, beyond and at nighttime, all of those things. So I want to echo that. I think the other thing here is that I've been sitting a bit with not simply his work, but his tweets, Sean Crowley, who has been articulating joy as a praxis. So yeah, the scripture is joy comes in the morning, but I wonder about the ways that particularly Black queer people practice joy in the midst of impossibly difficult sorrow. How do we practice the capacity for joy and communion? And joy isn't always happiness either, but how do you practice the capacity for holding one another in the midst of incredible sorrow? That's what joy feels like to me, something generative. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to wait for the morning for joy to come. As a matter of fact, joy might actually show up in the midst of some of the most difficult possibilities, but having held the hand of your beloved in the midst of that becomes a modality of joyousness, of joyous possibility. So I think that's the way to think about it. What if we reconfigured joy away from its affective European tethering as an emotion and understood it as a praxis that Black people have been, particularly Black queer folks, have been participating in for quite some time?
You know, until you said that, like, until you said the scripture related to that, I would have had no clue because I'm just like, wait, who said that joy comes in the morning? You know, like, really? I didn't get that memo. Because, like, when I wake up at like 5 a.m. to pray Fajr, I am the least happy person on God's green earth. I'm just like, I am only here so I don't get sent to hell. So let's be clear about all this right now. But to piggyback off of what Biko is saying, I think, at least from my standpoint, one of the interesting things about Muslim rituals, if you can call them that, is that there's always a different opportunity at different times of the day. So I may start off the day with joy being the farthest place away from my mind. But by the end of, say, like second evening prayer, I might have actually tapped into that joy, right? I think, as Biko said, if we think about joy as a praxis, and we're talking about within the context of religiosity, I always ask people, so what are your opportunities to be renewed, not just throughout the day, but throughout the year, right? what actually compels you towards joy as something that you return to purposefully, and you just don't wait to strike you like a lightning bolt, right? Because if you think of it as a praxis in the same way that being religious is a praxis, then you realize that there are endless opportunities for joy, that it isn't foreclosed to one particular point of the day that is relevant for like people who follow the New Testament, but that actually there are multiple opportunities to experience joy, and also in multiple different ways as well. So I think for me, as someone who literally does not know that scripture, you know, the cycles of my life offer me an opportunity to tap into joy at multiple times. So I always say, I am not confined by Gregorian time or calendars. So the time I find joy might be very different from the time of your son.
Go ahead, Candace.
I was gonna say, period. Like it just is. You know, in the last few years, I've been hearing, and I used to believe, I don't, maybe it's fair to say that I just don't know what I believe. I'm coming to know what I think I believe every day. And one of the things that I've really been sitting with is the idea of joy as resistance. So, you know, thinking about like some of the very kind of viral images that you see of, like, for example, Black children dancing at protests, or, you know, Black women rolling their eyes at police officers, or, you know, there was this one video I'm thinking of some Black people who were speaking with the police officer at a protest, and this one person is just like licking on this popsicle, and they're just like, okay, thank you very much. Like there was joy in, like, the popsicle itself became a part of the resistance, because nobody eats a popsicle like that, and to do so in front of the police, I think it kind of picked up because of the way it pushed. There was a choreography happening that was really significant. And I am at the place, or the time, you know, joy coming in the morning, where I just want joy to be for me. Like I think there is so much pressure, particularly when you are living in your truth, whatever that means, that your joy and your liveliness, I guess this is the other side of having a testimony, that it then becomes a product for someone else to understand, and even a place that they project their own desire for joy, because they wish they had a thing that you had, or like, I want to live that kind of life. Sometimes we swing that pendulum of like testimony and projecting, like, so people get really excited. Oh, like, you're my fave. You're like my fave in my head. Like, I've been doing this thing just for myself of like making reels, because I don't know how to use TikTok, but I do know how to use Instagram. So I've just been recording myself dancing, just because I think I'm cute and I want to see like video evidence of me dancing. And it's interesting to watch people respond to say like, oh, like, you give me life, or like, this joy like brought me, and it's difficult because I know what they're saying, and it's nothing radical. It's just me shaking my booty. Like it literally just is my flesh on screen, which then, you know, reminds us of just the situation we're in. This is a predicament that, like, me dancing to Stevie Wonder is some radical act when it ought not be. It's just me and my Black ass figuring out how to make the music and the video sync up together, because I don't have any, you know, young people in my life who could teach me how to do this thing. I'm learning how to do the tech in my own way. It's just gonna come together as it comes together. So this question of like joy, like, because I think there was a notion of, let me see if I can pull it. something about, oh, I can't see it in the little screen thing, but it was something about like the heteronormative and like homonormative lens through which we're reading these things. And people should just have to, I want to live in a world where people can just do the things that are affirming to them and healthy for the planet and healthy for all living creatures in the bit like on Earth. And it doesn't become this like revolutionary, like, oh, Black girl joy, like Black boy joy, you know, like it's literally just me and my onesie. It's really not that big of a deal. And maybe one day we'll get to the place where it's not that big of a deal. But I think it says more about where we are and when we are and what we have, and low key what we need to be preparing to do if that's like y'all went off of because of that. It really wasn't, you know. So.
Thank you all so much for your responses. We're gonna close out, but this little final conversation about joy has reminded me of this Prince song, which I'm sharing in the chat, Private Joy, which has been on my mind a lot when I think about, you know, what does it mean to have joy at all these moments that no one necessarily sees, where you're kind of inhabiting your existence in a way that, you know, you feel at home in the world and are attentive to, you know, the cool fall breeze on your skin as you're chilling on the porch or what have you. And I think this kind of expansive understanding of Black religion and sexuality, I think, makes the connections between that kind of private joy and something much larger than just the individual. But thank you to Biko, to Zaynab, and to Candace for joining us. Thank you to all the attendees for coming. We will put a recording of this up if you're interested, so be sure to follow the Virginia Tech Religion and Culture Twitter page for more on that. But yeah, I think we're done here. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you all on the other side. Bye.
Bye, y'all.
It was so great to hang out with y'all. I could talk to y'all all day, so I just want y'all to know that that's great.
Absolutely. When the outside opens up again, which I know everybody is saying, like everyone's like, when the outside open up, and I'm like, read the epidemiology, sweeties. It's not opening up anytime soon. But when it does, no. When it does, we should do this again.
Bottomless mimosas. That's what we're doing. Bottomless mimosas, Candace. I'm telling you.
Amen.
Praise the Lord, everybody.
All right, I'm gonna get us a private Zoom set up. So I'll talk to y'all later.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.